place, and any alterations to the landscape cannot change this. We remember those who came before us, and we prepare for those who will come after us. Here is where our ancestors laughed, cried, made music, honored our beliefs, loved, shared food, and made both useful and sacred things. This is where we raised our children and buried our dead. We remember what is now dry land when it was water, and we remember what is now water when it was dry land. We know this will change again, yet we are still here, and we will remain. Here is where we interacted with visitors from across oceans. These interactions brought new things, new tensions, new ideas. Here is where some of the visitors brought diseases that killed so many of our people, leaving those of us who were left behind bereft. Here is where those of us who remain survived and continue to make our lives. Here is where some of those visitors came to stay. Here is where we built, unbuilt, and rebuilt relationships with our new neighbors. Some of these relationships were friendly and beneficial. Others were fraught with conflict and sadness. Here is where we learned the English language and came to understand the values and beliefs of those who now lived among us. Here is where we used our literacy and knowledge to advocate for our people. And here is where the language of our ancestors was lost. Here is where those who came to live among us saw land, resources, and sometimes people as commodities to be bought and sold. Here is where we maintained, sometimes in secret, our commitment to our own beliefs about land, resources, and people. Here is where we made alliances, intermarried, and made new communities with people from other Native groups and with those from other cultures. Here is where we still make our lives. Here is where we laugh, cry, make music, honor our beliefs, share food, and make useful and sacred things. Here is where we raise our children and bury our dead. Here is where we honor those who came before us and prepare the way for those who are yet to come. This is the story of Native peoples across the continents. I ask you to remember that wherever you are in what is now known as the Americas, that you are in Native space and that there are people who belong to that place. As we come together, sorry, lost my place. As we come together tonight to talk about the Massachusetts state flag and seal, it's crucial for us to remember that this Commonwealth took its name from the name of one of the most prominent tribes that inhabited the same space as the early colonists, the Massachusett. So we actually invoke Native space each time we speak or write the word Massachusetts as the name of the Commonwealth. Native space is invoked every time we see the state seal or flag. This invocation is almost always unintentional, and it's usually done without knowledge of its significance. Even though I am a descendant of the original Massachusett tribe, I also interact daily with the name of the Commonwealth without an explicit acknowledgement of its origins with the Massachusett tribe. I'm working to change this so that every time I see or write the name of the Commonwealth, I remember where it originated and take time to honor those who came before me. I ask you to also consider taking the time when you encounter the Massachusetts name to consciously think about the Massachusetts tribe and all of the other many tribes who were the original inhabitants of this area. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Claire Gosselin. I work with the Massachusetts Peace Action, Racial Justice and Decolonization Working Group. And we're having this event tonight primarily to focus on the opportunity and the necessity, long overdue, to change the Massachusetts state and seal. We will also be hearing a little about some of the lands in trust being challenged, threatened, and also, I believe if Kevin Peterson shows up, we'll hear about Fanueil Hall. However, basically, we're going to have all the speakers speak, each for 10 minutes in sequence. We're not going to stop for questions in between. So if you have any questions, make note of them. We will open up at the end, and we will have some time for discussion at the very end, after the presentations. I also want to belatedly thank the Friends meeting for hosting this location, for John Bach for having arranged so much very nicely for us, and for all of you to have come. We will be passing around a basket that for donations if people have anything they contribute to help with campaign materials and things like that. So, and if you didn't sign in, please be sure to do so we can keep in touch with you. So the first speaker will be Jean-Luc Pierite, and he will speak about, he will explain what he's going to discuss. Then David Detmold, followed by Hartman, Deetz, and Elizabeth Solomon will speak again at the end. If we see Kevin, he will speak before Elizabeth. Thank you very much.
Oh, hello. Oh, hi. So my name is Jean-Luc Pierite. I'm originally from New Orleans, Louisiana. I'm a member of the Tunica Biloxi tribe of Louisiana. My paternal grandmother is also from the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians. At the Tunica Biloxi tribe of Louisiana, my family, my immediate family, my mom, Donna, and my sister Elizabeth, they work as culture and lifeways instructors, where we focus on language and culture preservation for our tribe. Here locally, I work with a nonprofit called the Fab Foundation that fosters the growth of the international Fab Lab network, over 1,500 Fab Labs in over 100 different countries. So there's that, but I also am the president of the board of directors at the North American Indian Center of Boston, which we're going to be going into our 50th year of combined history with the Boston Indian Council. And we basically work to promote indigenous rights and then the health and general welfare, the social well-being, the spiritual well-being of our community members. So when I was thinking about this issue, I wanted to actually kind of like be a representative of the voice of the people of the community where I come from, in New Orleans, Louisiana, but then also of the Louisiana Indians and how issues such as this have impacted our communities. And so I went back to May of 2017 and a speech that was given by Mayor Mitch Landrieu of New Orleans on the occasion of the removal of Confederate monuments in the city. Robert E. Lee stood prominently above a circle in the city, and as well, people were greeted by P.G.T. Beauregard, another Confederate soldier, to the entrance of our city park, but they're no longer there. And on the occasion of that, he gave this speech. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I wanted to kind of like go into some excerpts and then kind of give you some of my thoughts and how this actually relates to what we're faced here locally. So Mayor Landrieu says, the soul of New Orleans is deeply rooted in a history that has evolved over thousands of years, rooted in the diverse people who have been here together every step of the way, for both good and for ill. It is a history that holds in its heart the stories of Native Americans, the Choctaw, Houma Nation, the Chitimacha, and I would add the Coushatta in my own nation, the Tunica Biloxi, of Hernando de Soto, Robert Cavalier, the Cid de la Salle. And that's an important story to relate to here as well, because the Cid de la Salle is a French explorer who went down the Mississippi River. When he got down to the mouth of the Mississippi, that's where he planted a flag and said, well, this is Louisiana, I'm claiming it for the King of France. But what was most important was that accompanying him were 18 men their wives and their children from Native nations here in New England. And so I just want to make sure that I call the ancestors of all of our peoples and our shared history into this space. So it goes on, the Acadians, the Isleños, the enslaved people from Senegambia, free people of color, the Haitians, the Germans, both the empires of France and Spain, the Italians, the Irish, the Cuban, the South and Central Americans, the Vietnamese, and so many more. So with all of that beauty, all of that diversity, there's so much to be celebrated, and yet New Orleans was America's largest slave market, a port where hundreds of thousands of souls were bought, sold, and shipped up the Mississippi River to the lives of forced labor, of misery, of rape, of torture. America was a place where nearly 4,000 of our fellow citizens were lynched, 540 alone in Louisiana, where the courts enshrined separate but equal, where freedom riders coming to New Orleans were beaten to a bloody pulp. And the mayor goes on and recounts that there are no slave ship monuments, there are no prominent markers on public land to remember the lynchings or the slave blocks. But in central Louisiana, we actually have the Northup Trail. So if anybody is familiar with the narratives, 12 Years a Slave, that is actually, we have the physical places and we have a trail where all of that story is commemorated. And Solomon Northup did come to Indian Creek, which is a part of our tribal nation. So for those self-appointed defenders, and he's talking about the defenders, people who actually say, well, these monuments are a testament to history. It says these defenders of history and these monuments, they are eerily silent on the amounts of historical malfeasance, a lie by omission. There's a difference between remembrance of history and reverence of it. This cult of a lost cause, through monuments and through other means, to rewrite history, to hide the truth, which is that the Confederacy was on the wrong side of history. These statues are not just stone and metal. They're not just innocent remembrances of a benign history. These monuments purposefully celebrate a fictional, sanitized Confederacy, ignoring the death, ignoring the enslavement, and the terror that it actually stood for. After the Civil War, these statues were a part of that terrorism as much as burning a cross on someone's lawn. They were erected purposefully to send a strong message to all who walked in their shadows and who was still in charge in the city. And I remind everybody here that out in Boston Harbor Island, on George's Island, there is a Confederate monument. And so in 2016, President Barack Obama recalled a piece of stone talking about monuments, a slave auction block engraved with a marker commemorating a single moment in 1830 when Andrew Jackson, not a friend to Native people, and Henry Clay stood and spoke from it. President Obama said, "Consider what this artifact tells us about history on a stone where day after day for years men and women bound and bought and sold and bid like cattle on a stone worn down by the tragedy of over 1,000 bare feet. For a long time, the only thing we considered important, the singular thing we chose to commemorate as history with a plaque, were the unmemorable speeches of two powerful men." That piece of stone, it stood implicitly for all of that tragedy. And it was a tragedy that was perhaps forgotten or purposefully ignored. But there was the story that was commemorated, the speeches of these powerful men. And so when we look at these symbols, when we look at these statues, what are the two stories? What are the two sides of the stories? What is forgotten and what is commemorated? Mayor Landrieu must have passed by those monuments 1,000,000 times without giving them a second thought. Another friend asked me, back to his speech, to consider that these 4 monuments from the perspective of an African-American mother or father trying to explain to their 5th grade daughter who Robert E. Lee is and why he stands atop our beautiful city. Can you do it? Can you look into that young girl's eyes and convince her that Robert E. Lee is there to encourage her? Can we look at our children today and that symbol that was up, if we can just bring it back up again, can we look at that and say that is there to inspire our children? what we were going through in New Orleans. It was about showing the world that we, as a city and as a people, are able to acknowledge, understand, reconcile, and most importantly, choose a better future for ourselves, making straight what was once crooked and making right what was wrong. And at the second decade of the 21st century, asking anyone to drive by property that they own, occupied by reverential statues of men who fought to destroy the country, and deny that person's humanity seems perverse, absurd, and centuries-old wounds are still raw because they never healed right in the first place. Here is the essential truth. We are better together than we are apart. And so as I'm kind of like just being conscious of the time, I just wanted to set the tone for tonight and all of the discussions that we're having. What are the two stories that we acknowledge and what may be forgotten or purposefully ignored? And how, yes, at that time we were talking about the Confederacy, who obviously we can all say that they were on the wrong side of history. But how is it that the United States, what wrong side of history were they on? I have, our peoples here today, and I know that from the work of my family, the wrong side of history that the United States was on the diminishment of our self-governance, of our self-determination, our language, our culture, and bringing us into this sort of like homogenous identity. That's not who we are. And our children deserve better. So thank you.
Thank you, Jean-Luc. Thank you, Elizabeth Hartman, for being here tonight, and for all of you for coming out to help put our minds together about how we can affect a change that is now 390 years in the waiting. My name is David Detmold. I live in the western part of what is now called Massachusetts, in an area that has long been considered a joint resource area, the Great Falls. The Great Falls on the Connecticut River, sort of an area in between where the Nipmuc Nation and the Pocumtuck Nation and the Abenaki Nation and many other nations all joined together to, in the spring, come and take from the fish that would be swimming up the river to spawn. And so it was a place where people met in peace. No one claimed it as their own. Pardon me. And that's where I come from now. I think back to 2 summers ago when I rode my bicycle from Plymouth Rock to Standing Rock in South Dakota, and I was carrying gifts that were given to me by Cheryl Tony Hawley, who is the chief of the Nipmuc Nation, Hassanamisko Nipmuc Nation, and I was given gifts of tobacco and wampum from members of the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe to bring out to Standing Rock. And I did not know I had these precious gifts and sacred gifts to deliver to someone that I had yet to meet and did not know. But I knew that I would know that person when I got there. And after 6 weeks on the road, I came to a place in South Dakota called Greengrass, and there a man named Chief Arvel Looking Horse was conducting, and it was the 3rd day of a Sundance. And Arvel Looking Horse was the pipe keeper, as many of you know who were there, at the Ochete Sakowin camp at Standing Rock, where the Lakota people were standing on the front lines to protect the clean water, not just for their people, but for 17 or 18 million people who live downstream of that river system that is still fairly pure. And when I got there to that Sundance, and if you've never been to a Sundance, I cannot describe how powerful a religious ceremony, how powerful a sacred ritual that really is, where the whole people gather, and many of the bravest of the people will tie themselves by strong rope to a sacred cottonwood tree in the center of the circle, in this little dell, if you can imagine, between all these bluffs and the beautiful clouds overhead on the prairies of South Dakota. And in the blazing sun and between the clouds, they would for days dance and fast from food and water for the renewal of the people and for the protection of Mother Earth. And all the people would gather around, and the drumming and the singing and the sage that is burnt and the tremolo of the women when the men would finally break free from the ropes that would bind them as they dance and pray. And what I was thinking when I got there was that this is the strength of the people in the prayer of the people to keep the earth in balance, and what a hard job that is right now. And so I was humbled and honored to be there, and Arvel Looking Horse was leading that and made time to meet with me during lunch and receive these gifts from the Native nations of the Northeast who had entrusted them to me to bring. And when I sat down after that meeting and had lunch briefly, I met a woman who was Native American and teaching, and I don't know what tribe she was from, teaching at UC Davis in California. And I asked her, "What are you teaching there at UC Davis?" And she said, "I'm teaching visual sovereignty." And I had to admit, as a white man ignorant of this, that I did not understand what she was trying to say to me by saying she was a professor teaching visual sovereignty. She had to explain it to me. How obvious it is now, in retrospect, that it meant the ability and the right, the power of Native people of this country to define how their images are used in public space and how to tell their story is their own to tell. And so when I think of that and all the Indian Head golf courses that I passed on my bicycle trip and all the tobacco store Indians and all the bars and all the dusty prairie towns that I went through and all the bags of sacred cornmeal with the Indian Head logo on it, and I think about it now, it makes perfect sense to me that all the sports team mascots that have taken Native images and put them on their sports team jerseys as if they are war trophies, and that they can call themselves the Redskins, whether they're white or not. I see the need for all of us to get behind this teaching and this learning, that these are not our images, okay? And we can't use them for our official state flag and seal without the consultation and permission of the Native people of this land. So for 390 years, can we go to the next slide? That's what it looks like today. You see one downward pointed arrow. This was what it looked like 390 years ago when this seal was granted to the commercial corporation called the Massachusett Bay Company that sent the Puritans over here the year after they were granted this patent by the King of England. And they brought this with them, and it has remained in one form or another our state symbol ever since. And you can see the words coming out of this Native image's mouth, Native man's mouth, saying, "Come over and help us." Okay, this is the origin of our current state flag and seal. Next slide. If we can go to the next slide. Okay, at the time that the revolution broke out, that original seal that you saw had gone through a couple of changes, and it was held by the governor, the royal governor of England, who is still trying to hold on to the colony. They needed a new one. The revolutionary American rebels here in Massachusetts asked Paul Revere to come up with a new symbol, and he came up with this one. And for 5 years, this was the seal. Okay, you know, an English-American man with a sword, okay, that's pretty honest. And Magna Carta, you know, but of course Magna Carta calls up the idea of habeas corpus, bring out the bodies, and maybe that was a little bit too much for the colonists to bear. If they really started bringing out the bodies that they burned in Mystic, Connecticut when they wiped out the Pequots, the bodies that they burned at the Great Swamp when they I should not say they wiped out the Pequots, when they burned alive so many Pequot men, women, and children, old men, women, and children, and the same thing that they did to the Narragansetts, and the same thing they did in the town that I call home now, at Great Falls, on May 19th, 1676, when they attacked a refugee village of old men, women, and children who had been brought from the horrors of war here in the coastal regions to what they thought was a safe place, and they were attacked at dawn and killed. And you can follow this story all across the country. This is how we claimed the land, by the brutality of genocide. So they passed through this seal at that time and went back to the original one. May I see the next slide? And they went through many iterations of that. It had never been officially codified. Next few slides can go rather quickly. And so you see, they were drawing it in various ways, but it was always a native man with only one arrow pointed down and a sword over his head. Last slide, perhaps. One more slide after this. Okay. And if you take apart the images of what is now our state flag and seal and study in the archives at the State House, you'll see that they actually copied the sword from the sword in the Pilgrim Hall in Plymouth that is known to be the sword that was held by Miles Standish, who less than 3 years after the Hand of Friendship was offered to him by Osamequin, the Massachusett, was cutting off the heads of Massachusetts men in ambush with that sword. Okay, this is not an accident that they chose Miles Standish's sword and placed it on top of our State House in Beacon Hill. So, I know I'm running out of time. One more slide, and I will say that for 34 years, these are towns now that are going to be considering town meeting resolutions and city council resolutions calling upon our state legislators to reject this ancient image of white supremacy and to invite Native leaders, some of whom I hope are here in the room tonight, to sit at the table with the state legislators and come up with a new flag and seal. And it is the power of visual sovereignty that should tell us all that the Native leaders who are invited to sit at that table have the power to say, no, we don't want to have our image used at all on your state flag and seal. Or if we do choose to have our image, we don't want that sword over your head, over our heads. It is their right to say that, not ours. So in order to change that flag and seal, we're encouraging all of you in this room tonight to join with the rest of us who in Western Mass, on Cape Cod, and right here in Boston, in the next few months, will be bringing supporting resolutions to our towns and city councils, town meetings and city councils, saying, time for a change. And we can talk more about that during the question and answer. Thank you very much.
Winimnakan, Nataswis Hartman Deetz, Nutamas Masipiat, Nin Wampanoag, Katapatash Wachiwami Hawanikiwat Yunakana. Good evening, my name is Hartman Deetz. I'm from Mashpee, I'm a Wampanoag, and thank you all for being here tonight. As a Wampanoag, we have a particular relationship with this flag and the symbolism of this flag. As Wampanoag people, we were the first people to welcome the English when they showed up here after the plague in 1617. We had lost about 90% of our people, and we were regrouping and figuring out how to live again in this world. And the English showed up on our shores in a village that was empty, and we allowed them to stay under the provision that we would have mutual aid and assistance. That treaty didn't last too long. By 1637, the English were making war on the Pequots, wiping out villages. By a generation later, in the 1670s, the sons of the men who signed that treaty of mutual aid and assistance were fighting the most bloody war ever fought on a per capita basis in this land. On a per capita basis, more life lost than the American Revolution or the War of 1812 or Greylock's War or Queen Anne's War or King George's War or the French and Indian War. On a per capita basis, whole towns were wiped out on both sides. The destruction of the Great Swamp Village was a part of that war that David mentioned. The destruction of pushing the people off the cliffs at Turner's Falls, or Great Falls, as David calls it. This was also a part of that war. Anyway, this war was led by a man that the English called King Philip. They called him King Philip because they had to change his name to anglicize it, because they wouldn't acknowledge the name that he had been given by his own people, Metacom. They chose to make it more suitable for their needs. The leader of our nation, the figurehead of our people, and they chose to change his name for him, call him King Philip. So he led the resistance, and a lot of Native people bonded together, some eagerly in the beginning and some after some resistance. The Narragansetts didn't join the war until after the Great Swamp Massacre. Some people didn't want to get into another fight, another war, but it was all brought together and led by this man, Metacom. By the end of the war, we had great success in the beginning, driving English people out. They were leaving here, getting in boats, going back to England faster than they were showing up. They were going to build a palisade fence around the whole city of Boston. But then, as things happened, the tides changed. The Iroquois Confederacy signed up with the English, and they showed them how to transverse the swamps and come into the swamps, into our strongholds, where we were then vulnerable, where we had our safe retreats. And eventually, the tides turned, and Metacom was killed by a Wampanoag man, as often happens with our true heroes in this world, our resistance people. It's often they're taken by the hands of their own. You see this story again and again and again. They allowed the Wampanoag man to keep his hand pickled in a jar, which he would show off for nickels later on, or half pences, I guess is more the right thing. They quartered his body and sent his arms and legs to the four corners of the English Empire. And they cut off his head. They cut off his head and they displayed it on the top of a pike in Plymouth. That's what the sword is above the head of the native man that they take so many examples of to try to make it as if he might be King Philip, Metacom. That's what that sword is. That sword continues to hang over the head of Native people in Massachusetts. And it's not just symbolism. It's not just, an imagination or us thinking up things that it might mean. That's literally what happened to the leader of our people. He was beheaded, his head chopped off, displayed. And we live under that threat, and we continue to live under that threat today. From continued genocide, from continued dispossession, from continued oppression. It continues right now, even today, as Native people in Massachusetts and across the country, really. This is a symbol of white supremacy. This is a symbol of white supremacy, the rights of people by virtue of the skin that they were born into to come and take from other people. simply because they want it. The Crown of England gave them a charter to come and take our land from us. And they came and they used violence, death, and destruction to do that, to achieve that. And you know, the monuments to slavery that were put out there, you know, we talked about them earlier, and they didn't import a lot of slaves into New England. And that's because they had Indian slaves. You know, they didn't need to import slaves from Africa. They exported more slaves from New England between the 1630s and the 1730s than they imported African slaves to the Carolinas. So these are also a part of this white supremacy that happens in New England. They act like racism was a Southern problem and that these Confederate statues are something else. The truth of the matter is that white supremacy is an American problem. And it's everywhere. And New England is not exempt just because they fought in the North for the Civil War, and just because the American Revolution took place here does not make New England exempt from racism. New England exempt from white supremacy. It's very deeply rooted here in the very foundations of the existence of these colonies that were built on the idea that by virtue of their whiteness, people from across the ocean had the right to our land, to our country, to our territory. You know, and these symbols, you know, these symbols are hurtful, and they continue to be hurtful. They aren't just a matter of what we have that we, you know, oh, it's a drawing of a sword. Well, you know, how can we expect to try to find justice when we go into a courtroom and that's the flag that's on the wall with the sword over our head? How can we expect to get justice when that's the badge on the door of the police car that shows up? How can we expect to get justice from a state that holds the motto, by peace, but only, you know, what is it? By only... Peace under the sword. Only peace under the sword. There you go. By peace, but only under the sword. That's not truthful peace. That's not real peace. You know, peace is not when you stop resisting because of the threat to your life or to your ability to exist. You know, that's not peace. That's imprisonment. You know, and we see these symbols that they continue again and again, not only in the state flag. We see these symbols in the national sports teams like the Redskins. You know, the term Redskin itself, historically, I don't know how many of you all understand this, that when they hunted Indians and you were to bring back proof of death, well, for one, they had you bring back just the heads of the Indians, but the women in the towns complained that the smell was too bad. And then they said, okay, you can just bring in the scalp of an Indian. You get the top tier price for an adult man, and you get half price for an elder, a woman, or a child.
That was Massachusetts.
That's Massachusetts, and you get paid out. And they didn't find the comfort in the idea of calling these Indian skins, so they started calling these pelts, these scalps, redskins. And this is what they say honors us and celebrates us when we say that this is offensive, that this isn't right, that this is a stereotype, that this hurts our people, that our kids go to school and they have to deal with people wanting to cut their hair, or they say that they don't look like an Indian, or they show up slapping their lips at our kids. You know, I have my kids come home and say that they don't want to dance at powwow anymore, that they want to change their name, that they want to cut their hair. This is why these things happen, because we hold these symbols up and we emulate these things as what we should reach for and what we should aspire to and what we celebrate. And if we continue to celebrate these things, if we continue to celebrate racism, if we continue to celebrate might makes right, if we continue to celebrate white supremacy, this is what we're going to continue to have in this world. And if we don't break from that soon, you know, I don't know what we're headed for. It's a mess. I guess my time is up, but I'd hope to get to a little bit more, maybe in the questions and answers, or as it goes. I could probably talk for too long, but anyway, thank you all.
Good evening. People, I don't want to hold it up, but you don't have to hold it for me if you can put it down. Do you mind?
If you put it near the computer, yeah.
Okay. You hear me? Yeah. This is fine? My name is Kevin Peterson. I'm from
It's still on.
and I'm from Boston, from an organization that's focusing on changing the name of Fanueil Hall in the city of Boston. Most of you probably have been through Fanueil Hall, and it is new to a lot of people that I've been engaging with over the last couple of years, that Fanueil Hall is connected to the same sort of racism symbolically, but factually, in terms of its connection to slavery, its connection to the larger issue around white supremacy. So Fanueil Hall was constructed in 1742. It was donated to the city by Peter Fanueil, who was a slave owner, and this is part of our contention, is that in the city of Boston we should not have celebrated public buildings that are connected to the issue of slavery and white supremacy. So Fanueil Hall in 1742 donated the building, and the interesting lore, the interesting story about the donation was that Peter Fanueil wanted this, what was essentially a business park in downtown Boston, where he could have some offices and there could be a place where wares are sold. But in his effort of getting that hall constructed, he had to go through a lot of the local politics with the town fathers. The city of Boston was at that time a town. And Peter Fanueil wrote a letter to the town fathers saying that he would personally underwrite the costs connected to the construction of the building, and that he would sell a African boy, slave, to finance the building, and in fact that is what he did. So we in Boston are connected to the larger sort of push against white supremacy that started as Jean-Luc sort of opened up with the efforts in the South and New Orleans and other cities and municipalities across the South to pull down monuments that are dedicated to slavery and white supremacy. Our contention, as the contention is around with these other movements across the South, is that this, the removal of monuments and the changing of the name of Fanueil Hall is a metaphor towards getting toward larger, more substantive discussions around race. So in Boston in 2018, if you're African American, Latino, or Cape Verdean male between the age of 18 and 34, you're more likely to be a victim of murder, and your murder case is less likely to be solved. In the city of Boston, the average net worth of a white family, as some of you may have heard, is $285,000 when compared to the average black family in the city is $8. That's $2 less than $10. If you are a young person of color matriculating through the Boston public schools, you're less likely to graduate than your white counterpart, and you're less likely to go to college. The unemployment rate for black males in the neighborhood of Mattapan approaches nearly 60% for a certain cohort. So we would like to have conversations throughout the city of Boston around the issue of Fanueil Hall as it connects to contemporary times. So the symbolism of the building is horrible, but it also is an opportunity. We want to use the changing of the name of Fanueil Hall as an opportunity to have deep conversations around how we change the levels of equality and equity in the city of Boston. So it is not just black people, it's not just not Latino people, but white people also want to be engaged in the issue of changing the name. The symbolism is horrible. Someone mentioned that slavery in Boston wasn't pervasive. It was at some point. Slavery was initiated in the Bay Colonies legally. First colony to create African slavery. It was also the first colony, the first state to eliminate slavery. So there are good things and there are some positive things in Massachusetts where we can point to in terms of engaging the larger issue of addressing systemic racism and white supremacy. So I'm here to ask for your support. I am from the New Democracy Coalition. We're on the website, thenewdemocracycoalition.org. There's more information about our efforts to change the name. Just connected to that, I think I just have just a few minutes left, but connected to that, we are facing surprising pushback from the mayor of the city of Boston, who doesn't want to have a hearing around the feasibility of changing the name. He has not allowed us a hearing. More shocking than that is that no member of the Boston City Council, 13 members, has agreed to host a hearing. So we've initiated just about a month ago a tour through Boston's 27 neighborhoods, living rooms, coffee shops, places like that, to educate people around the city of Boston about our efforts around changing the name. But we are still insistent around having a public hearing so that we can get toward the larger issues of changing public policy in the city over time. So there's education, there's healthcare, there's public safety, there is representation, issues that impact the lives of everyone in the city of Boston are in some ways impacted by race. And we believe that there is a palpable, there is no disconnection. There is no disconnection between the white supremacy initiated in the 1600s and the 1700s and the white supremacy that exists in 2018. Just one last point. At Fanueil Hall, there is a place called the Fanueil Hall Marketplace, which is right behind the actual Fanueil Hall building. The Fanueil Hall Marketplace is in fact a slave port where Africans were sold for decades. About 2 months ago, we had a reenactment of an auction, a slave auction. And it was meant to educate the public to the fact that bodies sold, black bodies sold and dehumanized 3 centuries ago in the city of Boston are representative of the levels of tragedy and the levels of inhumanity that still exist in the city of Boston. In fact, the irony is that those bodies sold in the 1750s, those black bodies at the Fanueil Hall Marketplace, where the food court is, those bodies sold at that time are worth more then than the average net worth of a black family in 2018. So the enormity of the inhumanity that exists in the city remains. And while we may be uncomfortable about it, while the mayor might be uncomfortable about it and others, it's true. Latinos, African Americans in the city suffer disproportionately in what we consider the Athens of America, one of the most enlightened cities in the world. We are facing this incredible contradiction. So I'll stop there, but thank you, and I join in solidarity in terms of changing the state.
Burning sage or something. I think it's just a fireplace there. Is
Yeah.
there something in that? Is there something added to it?
No, I just put the log on myself.
We have
No.
a fire all the time.
All right. All right, so
Are you having
hopefully,
an allergic reaction?
Pardon?
Are you having an allergic reaction?
yeah, she's having
Yeah,
an
some
allergic
kind of
reaction
reaction,
to this, to the old room.
As I mentioned earlier, my name is Elizabeth Solomon. I'm a member of the Massachusett tribe at Ponkapoag. And I had some prepared remarks, but I think I want to riff a little bit about on what other folks have talked about and really re-emphasize the fact that everything that we're talking about really boils down to issues of white supremacy. And so this is true for African Americans, it's true for Native Americans, it's true for, in this point in time in our country, Muslim Americans and Muslims across the world. I mean, basically, we really have to think about what the bottom line of this is. And how each one of us who has concerns about this is going to address it. People talked a lot about, the taking of Native American scalps, talked about selling black bodies. One thing that wasn't talked about in terms of that certainly happened to the particular tribe I'm from, which we were originally part of the Neponset band of the Massachusett tribe. And for those of you who are familiar with Neponset, that's on the coast in Quincy. In the mid-1650s, as you must understand, Boston was pretty much the central locus of, at that time, colonial expansion in the United States. And we were right in the middle of it. And so in the mid-1650s, we were actually removed to a praying town called Ponkapoag Reservation. And from then on, instead of being known as Neponset, we were known as Ponkapoag, because generally we take our names from the places that we live. This was a grant from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts for 6,000 acres. And although the tribe owned the land, and I say owned in parentheses, the Commonwealth basically required that there be white male guardians to assure that the best interests of the Native people that were living there, Ponkapoag, my ancestors. And that management came from it ranged from as far as something as simple as the lease of land to white farmers, to the actual sale of pieces of the plantation. And by the mid-1700s, just 100 years after the establishment, the Commonwealth basically agreed to a formal survey of Ponkapoag lands, And in 1760s, the Commonwealth formally granted a tribe a title to 710 acres. The 6,000 acres was never formally basically granted to us in terms of actual legal title. At that time, the acreage was 710 acres. So out of 6,000 acres, almost 90% of it was gone within 100 years. 75 years later, the Guardians sold off what was the last remaining piece of the plantation that was held by the tribe. Interestingly, most of those sales took place to assuage the debts of the actual guardians and or people who claimed that they had, that the tribe or members of the tribe had debts to them. And so basically we were dispossessed of land. Not only did we move, but we were dispossessed of the land that we basically agreed to move to. In case you might think that that's something that happened in the past, I will tell you a more recent story. I will say that basically, even though there was no land that was held by the tribe in common, there were individuals and families who remained in Ponkapoag and owned their land well into the 1940s and later. In the 80s, we were able to, through the generosity of somebody who was married to one of our descendants, deeded us a share of a relatively large piece of undeveloped land. Now, we weren't the sole owners. And it took us just 10 years and an incredibly brutal fight in the Massachusetts land court to actually have a part of that land partitioned and for us to have it actually ownership free and clear. And the way I talk about how in terms of this dispossession and actually white supremacy, the other major owner of the land, who was a white woman, the only way we were able to get it partitioned was for us to sign the deed, a deed restriction saying we could never build anything on that land. The remaining piece of the land was sold to a developer to build luxury single-family homes. This still continues. So what do I see when I look at the Mass State Seal? A number of things. One of them is that there is a Native person on the seal. There are not a lot of state seals that do have Native people on them. And on some levels, I feel like that is a testament to our incredible resilience. We are still here. We are still here. All of us are still here. We're not going anywhere. This land... One of the things that I said earlier is that we don't own the land, we belong to the land. We belong to the land. And so some of it I see is the resilience, but then in addition, the issue of the sword and the issue of the motto beginning, by the sword we seek peace. How can you seek peace by a sword? I don't know. But actually, if you look at what Miles Standish did, he actually did behead Massachusetts warriors in Wassagusset, which is now Weymouth, and took a head of a Massachusetts warrior back to Plymouth for display. So we're really talking about, I don't even have words for it. I don't have words for it. So, I really kind of, beyond the issue of the Massachusetts flag, that's one thing that we have this forum about, but in addition, I think we have to look, as you were saying, across the board about what white supremacy has meant for our history, which we do not tell accurately, and for what is happening and continues to happen now, and if we don't stop it, will continue to happen in the future. Thank you.
So thanks again to our speakers. Now we're going to enter into questions, answers, comments, and we would like people to keep it to 2 minutes. However, before we start that, I would like to read briefly certain ground rules. We understand there may be disagreements. We agree that disagreement is okay, but that we can keep on talking. We want everyone to remember it does take courage to speak, and so please do listen actively. And in the case of disagreement, please provide constructive counterpoints without attacking the individual. Be open to changing your mind. Be respectful. And we ask that you please speak not more than 2 minutes so that we can allow for more people to speak. Thank you very much. This is where we can co-facilitate. Anybody have questions? To be heard better.
Yeah, you might want to come up just so.
I can raise my voice loud enough.
Okay, if anybody has trouble
I've
hearing.
done it here many times. I wanted to make a comment about the time when I was before Judge Troy in 2011, and I presented to him an image of art to point out and to correlate the state flag of Massachusetts as being barbaric, genocidal, hideous, and at that time, during the presentation in the court, I demanded the Attorney General make a temporary injunction against the state seals and flags. It was her duty, Martha Copley's duty, to do that according to law, but she failed to do that. But the judge understood something that I had presented. It was this image here. I took the arm here. This is a work about someone else did. And I pointed out how if you could have a red man's arm, I use red man, I say red man respectfully, red man's arm, native arm, over a white person who is a minority nowadays. And if the red people were the majority, how would the white people feel? This is an intimidation against the white people. And Miles Standish's arm, a known murderer of Native American Indians, should not be allowed to stand on our flag. He was the head police officer of the white people. And the white people today should be outraged. It should not have anything to do with Miles Standish. And my final word is this. We should get reparation, not just the separation of this and taking it away. We should get reparations, some land back, like Miles Standish State Park. It should be given back to our native people.
Other comments, other questions?
This one in the back.
My name is Laura, and I'm the director of the Unitarian Universal State Action Network here in Massachusetts. So we have folks statewide, and there's a lot of people who feel deep shame over this and want to be involved in this campaign. Can you share some words about how we can do that and be in right relationship? What would that look like? How would working together? How would you like to see that unfold?
Would you like me to do that?
And Dave, we changed emails. Nice.
Yes, Laura, it's very nice to meet you. And I hope we hear from everybody in the room tonight, if we have time, about how we can answer Laura's question. And what I really think is, you need to kind of take back the power that New England Town Meeting it uniquely gives to everybody who lives within the so-called town borders and of the Commonwealth, the so-called Commonwealth. I keep saying so-called because, as we've heard tonight, it is the colonial settler society that has defined those terms. And I think right there, that's not fair. But they've defined it in New England, if you want to call this northeastern part of Turtle Island, New England, in such a way that we have great strength, great power, all of us, to affect this change. It only takes the signatures of 10 registered voters to put any issue before a town meeting. I am shocked and deeply embarrassed that the Boston City Council will not give you a hearing. And I think everybody in this room should address that issue as well, because these issues are the same. And we should work through the networks that are now being set up. There's a website here, I'll pass this around if I could, called changethemassflag.com. And you can see how this campaign to have more and more cities and towns weigh in this spring, just a few months from now. And I'm hoping we now have volunteer coordinators in 24 towns from Cape Cod to Berkshire County who are going to be saying our town, our city, no longer wishes to be represented by this flag and seal. Okay, and there's just quickly, and other people join in from the panel, please. Of course, you can continue to call your legislators, but I like to remember what my friend Wally Nelson, a great civil rights activist who rode the buses down and was beaten for it in the 40s to test the validity of the Supreme Court rulings that said that they shall no longer enforce segregation on interstate buses. Wally Nelson used to say to us out in Franklin County, you don't want to get on your knees and beg the legislators to do something. You want to create the conditions and demand and create the conditions where they can no longer resist making these changes that are so long overdue. And when I think about that in relation to Boston and the issue of the flag and seal, and I think about it during the general war of resistance that Hartman detailed, what we call King Philip's War. Native people were brought in chains to Boston Common throughout the later part of 1676, and they were executed on Boston Common. In August and September of 1676, more than 45 captive Native Americans, Native people, were either shot or hung on Boston Common. And when I think about that, I think when this bill, which is being refiled to change the flag and seal, it comes up for a hearing, we should not go into that hearing room and beg for them to do this. We should be out in Boston Common in the hundreds or the thousands, and we should be supporting the ceremonies of healing that could take place there. And we should be inviting the media who are going to be paying attention now like never before, because the 400th anniversary of the Pilgrim Landing or Pilgrim Invasion is taking place in 2020 when this bill will pass. I'm telling you, with all of our help, we're going to pass it this time. Okay, thank you.
I think what might be good to, because we have probably about 45 minutes left, just to make sure that we don't, there's a lot of information here on this flyer, and I think it would be good to open it up for some additional questions, if that's okay. And I think there was someone in the back that had a question or a comment. Yes, please.
I'll shout. Thank you very much for your work and this presentation and
all of the efforts to move this forward. It's an issue that I find very powerful, having been to the State House many times and seen the different versions of our state seal in stained glass in various forms there, and it brings me shame. I would like to know, thousands of bills are filed every legislative session, and I'm wondering if there are particular senators and representatives that we would like to target as lead sponsors, because the bills need to get filed from the beginning of our next term, which is this year, and we just need a little bit of guidance, if you would.
I'll be brief. I'm sorry. The bill is being refiled by Joe Comerford, who is the senator from the Franklin, Hampshire district. It is being refiled in the House by Lindsay Sabadosa from Northampton, and it is being supported in the Senate by a senator from Maynard, Jason Lewis. So there are 3 people who have stepped forward. That leaves everybody else's representative and senator waiting to be brought on board. And if you will become a follow this website, as soon as those bill numbers are out in public, we'll get it out to each and every one of you, and you can all call, write your representatives and senators to join.
I just wanted to just quickly just acknowledge that in Jamaica Plain, we're very fortunate to have Nika Lagardo, and even though she's a freshman, she has a lot of energy. We're very grateful to have an advocate such as her in our district. I also kind of wanted to point out, I hope you don't mind, Linda, but I know you've been working on the mascot issue here, and if you had like any names that you could also add to the discussion.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, do you want to just really quickly?
I can shout.
Okay.
We are having a bill reintroduced this session to eliminate Native American mascots in Massachusetts public schools because of the same issues of white supremacy and racism. Excuse me. And Senator Joe Comerford is going to be introducing that bill in the Senate, and we are looking for a House representative to introduce that as well. We have asked Representative Jack Lewis in Ashland, Framingham, and we're waiting to hear back from him. But we're asking people to, once this gets introduced, to please contact your state rep and state senator asking for co-sponsorship. Thank you.
I have a question. I think we're agreeing is changes that need to be made to the seal. However, I'm seeing here what's wrong with it, but in the bill that's being introduced, are we saying how we want it changed? What we want changed about the flag?
Well, I mean, I think that's, I kind of feel conflicted here. Because I do feel that with the name of the state being taken from an Indian tribe, there should be some recognition of Native peoples on our state seal. I also recognize that even though we're the original people, we are no longer the only people here. And we are no longer the only people here. And that we live in a state where there are multiple people, and the seal should represent not just us as original people, but it should represent the state as a whole. And how that happens, I don't know. And that's just my personal opinion. I don't know if, do you want to? And so I think that and I believe members of my tribe would like to have have a Native person on the seal. But we're not the only ones that are making the decision either. I think the main thing is really the white supremacist iconography needs to go.
Do you have any contact with any artists that could help conceptualize an alternate?
Well, the state is full of artists, I'm sure, as are the tribes. There are many artists amongst the tribes. I just wanted to add on, or I guess maybe offer another take, is that personally, I do feel that having a Native person reflected on the flag of Massachusetts and the colonial history that's involved, it's important to keep some visibility as Native people, especially a place where we've been so erased in so many other ways and continue to be erased and continue to be dispossessed. My community is also, under the chopping block right now as well, being dismissed as Indians. But the sword above the head of the Native people, it's a really simple thing to change. There's a Northeast tradition of the Tree of Peace. Just take that arm and that sword and put a pine tree above it. And it changes the whole dynamic of everything else underneath it. It's no longer a threat to keep people oppressed. It's no longer a tool to keep people down. It's no longer, people being subjugated by violence. It's the Tree of Peace, which I think everybody should be able to come under and be happy and be able to be content with one another. That's what peace is. That's what peace really is.
Cole Harrison from Peace Action. Just to say that, and David can probably explain the best, but this bill has actually been filed for like 30 years in the state legislature, but the person who always filed it, Byron Rushing, is no longer in the legislature. So that's the reason for a new renewed push, or one of the reasons for a new renewed push this year. But the bill calls for a commission to be formed to study and recommend a new seal. So we don't have to design the new state seal in the next 7 days before the bill has to be filed. That's going to be a process of discussion. Mass Peace Action is here in addition to all the reasons that have been given, because the colonial wars of Massachusetts were actually when the American Army was formed, and that army is now making war throughout the world. So this warrior culture that was brought down upon the Massachusetts and the Wampanoag and the Narragansett and the Nipmuc carries on today. So we actually are filing a suite of bills in the state legislature to address nuclear disarmament and divestment from Raytheon, which is making war in Yemen, and other matters, and as well as this one. And we will we'll probably hold and we actually have a Massachusetts Peace and Justice Network, which is a network of groups concerned with peace and justice that's going to meet in Northampton on Saturday, and we'll probably hold a lobby day on January 23rd. Don't quote me because it's not final, but it's probably January 23rd at 10 a.m. One of the things that we have to do in the State House process is somebody said there's 160 we have to go around and get. So we actually want everyone to come down to the State House that day, run around the building, and get as many legislators to co-sponsor the bill as possible. So that's just one more piece.
Other questions or comments?
And if you sign up on the setup sheet, we'll make sure to remind you when that event actually happens.
Just a couple of things. I wanted to, some people have been asking about the design that the new flag will take. I just wanted to point out, if you go online to a site called Vexillology Wiki, which I'd be willing to show, there is a page for Massachusetts with 53 different proposals for a new flag. And another thing I wanted to ask was, a couple of you alluded to problems with the motto, and the motto is generally separate from the seal and the flag, so do you think that should have to change as well?
Actually, the motto is, I think, yes, the motto, as I said, part of the motto starts with, by the sword we seek peace. So that is part and parcel of the problem. Yes.
And I just wanted to go back to the speech from my former mayor in New Orleans. And, when we were taking down these Confederate monuments in New Orleans, what we're thinking about is what to put up in its place. And so when we're thinking about new monuments, forging symbols and things like that, what is the history that we're reflecting today? Because we are a part of the history, we are part of the chain of history. And so when we talk about the symbols, when we talk about the motto, I don't think that's the motto of any of the people in this room. You've all come here with the courage of your convictions, and I don't see people living under that motto or any of that iconography. And so I just want, it's the soul searching that needs to happen, and the sort of community process of like, who are we as citizens of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and who are we as the indigenous nations that reside here in Massachusetts? How can we come together and forge a motto, forge a path that we can all follow into the future?
Amen. Other questions? Yes.
Not a question, more a comment, and more addressed to my brothers and sisters who identify as white. I actually have a huge debt to NACOP for asking me to understand my own history. This actually came from it to me several years ago. Led me to read this book, which I recommend to everyone, An Indigenous People's History of the United States by Gosselin, Dunbar, Ortiz. If you have not read that book, you must. It transformed my understanding of how embedded I am in the mainstream culture as someone who thought they were working on structural racism, to understand how deeply embedded we all are. So that's one thing. The other is my church, the First Church Unitarian Universalist in Jamaica Plain, has for the second year is sponsoring a Dismantling White Supremacy film series where we show some pretty interesting and provocative films and have facilitated discussion. Again, this is really, my white brothers and sisters. This is our work. I invite you on this Friday at 7 o'clock at First Church and the Jamaica Plain Forum and the Theodore Parker Church are all the co-sponsors. We're showing a film called Rumble, which actually addresses, it sort of highlights the incredible contributions of the Native American community to all genre of American music. So show up at 7 o'clock. You don't have to be white, but but it's really hard, I just feel like that's the word.
Yes. Do you want to come up?
Three things. One is I've made a number of suggestions which are on the white paper. The second is people, when you're giving the name of a website or an organization, I'm partly hearing you say, well, please say it twice clearly, because there may be others who don't catch everything. And then the third thing is I wanted to suggest Pat Jones, who is our local state senator, is having a soup party a week from Sunday. It's a wonderful gathering with lots of politicians. It would be great fun if you could get there.
Thank you for your suggestions, and I'll take you up on one of them. The website, and I think nothing would be better right now than to share it widely with your friends throughout Massachusetts, is change the mass, M-A-S-S, flag.com. And it's listed on the bottom of that yellow or goldenrod leaflet. Okay, we're going to keep everybody in touch with the bill numbers, the legislation as it comes forward, anything we can do to be in support of changing the name of Fanueil Hall. We'd love to promote that on the website as well if you would allow us to do so.
Is there anybody else? Because I know you've already spoken. I want to make sure there's. Oh, okay, please. Yes, I'm sorry, sir. We'll get back to you.
I just wanted to say, this is like kind of a big, you're already doing this bill just for the flag and the seal. But throughout the state, obviously, we have a lot of problematic sports team names, let's say, and Wampanoag just saying, and then we've got our neighbors, Medfield, with, the Warriors, with maybe the war on it, lots of inappropriate things. And I just wonder if we might consider introducing some kind of legislation that instead of being targeted at a specific image, would just say that in the state of Massachusetts, that no government entity should promulgate white supremacy through official imagery and names. And then under that statute, that you could just sue whoever was still doing it or threatening it. I don't know, just a thought.
Linda's working on the issue.
Hi, the bill that we're hoping to reintroduce is specifically targeted about Native American mascots because there are about 38 public schools in Massachusetts that still use these. And the language of the draft of the bill that is going to be presented will be tasking the Department of Early and Secondary Education to create standards about mascots so that they do not denigrate any particular culture or race. But it is specifically for Native American mascots because that's the biggest problem right now.
And with Linda's permission, we will keep you updated on the progress of that bill as well on the website.
And sir in the corner who Oh, there's somebody. I'm sorry. I didn't see you.
It was cold, so I kept my hood on. Hey, everybody. I'm Rayshana. Good to meet you. I learned so much from y'all. Thank you for sharing. Oh, Lord. So I'm a researcher over at Harvard and Tufts, and at Tufts we created the African American Trail Project. This little map here. And so, just here? Yeah?
It's caused by standing in front of the
Oh, technology. All right. I keep messing this up. Jesus. Well, I could have been done by now. Jesus. Anyway. Sorry. So I'm over at Harvard and Tufts, and we have the African American Trail Project. But we also want to be mindful that we're cultural beneficiaries, right? And so there are a number of sites on the map, including, ones that reference Crispus Attucks, who's of mixed ancestry. My question is, how can I be a good steward of all this history, especially where it overlaps in stuff like our physical map, our websites, my personal research? Because, I live here now, but I'm from Chicago with roots in the Mississippi Delta. I'm not quite sure, what the best practices are when it comes to cataloging histories that really aren't mine. Where can I sit this down?
How to be a good, in the age of technology, I think it's important to upload this stuff onto the internet, to create a website, and to foster as many connections as you can, people in this room and the people whom you made contact in terms of creating the map. There is a lot of cross-sectionality, so to speak. You mentioned Crispus Attucks, part African American, part First Nation. And in fact, there is an effort within the movement I'm involved in terms of renaming, pushing towards renaming Fanueil Hall Crispus Attucks Hall for that reason, because he represents, because he indeed sort of represents what America should be about. I know Mass Peace Action is here, but Crispus Attucks was, I think, the first to die in the Revolutionary War, what became the Revolutionary War. First veteran, so to speak, as he was pushing back against the British. Crispus Attucks was so enamored by the town fathers for his efforts that he ironically was laid in state for 3 days where? Fanueil Hall. So we continue to push around the issue of educating people around the city of Boston and throughout the Commonwealth and the nation. Fanueil Hall is a national monument, so to speak. More people come through the Fanueil Hall campus each year than Disney World. Wow. It is the #1 tourist place in the country. $165 million of revenue come through there. The city leases Fanueil Hall to a company in New York, and the city gets about $4 million out of the $164 million. So that's not even, that's not even fair. So I encourage, someone asked about how you could sort of contribute to our efforts. We've called on a boycott of Fanueil Hall, so please don't buy there. The marketplace and the Fanueil Hall site itself as a show of solidarity. Also called members of the Boston City Council. And I don't think you have to be restricted in terms of living in the city of Boston, because Fanueil Hall is a national landmark. So please call the mayor and call the members of the Boston City Council and ask them to support a hearing this year. It is an embarrassment in terms of our democracy that we're not allowed a voice, and we know why. Because the conversation will open up the proverbial can of worms, right? It's in terms of the economics of the city, in terms of Boston being the 7th most segregated city in the country, the issues around hiring within the city of Boston itself, those public jobs. A study came out yesterday in the city of Boston about how the fire department is extraordinarily segregated, not only along the lines of race, but along the lines of gender and the misogyny that sort of happens. That's not disconnected with white supremacy, because it's another form of violence from people towards other people. So again, sister, I think it's just important to maintain the networks and continue to engage people. I would love to have a copy of your map. I'd like to reference it on our website. And someone asked about the website. So my website is thenewdemocracycoalition.org.
Say it twice.
thenewdemocracycoalition.org. And our project is the Fanueil Hall Race and Reconciliation Project. The Fanueil Hall Race and Reconciliation Project. It's not aimed towards erasing the history of white people, which the mayor has gone on TV to say, that his history is at risk. No, literally, that's what he said. To be fair, he says if we change the name of Fanueil Hall, nobody will know the name of Fanueil Hall 30 years from now. It left us, yeah. Peter Fanueil 30 years from now. But it left us scratching our head because he sold the boy for the price of the construction of Fanueil Hall, and we don't know that boy's name. We don't know his name. We don't know his history. And we should think of that boy and think about changing the name in that boy's name that we don't know. His name should be called Freedom, right? That boy's name should be called Justice. That boy's name should be called Peace and Reconciliation and Truth. So that's our effort, and it's multicultural, and it's meant to engage the different, the full diversity of the city with a level of honesty that we saw in New Orleans under the leadership of the mayor there. I don't know if all of New Orleans is like that, but that's the level of honesty and engagement that we would like to see here in the city of Boston. So thanks.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up? Would you consider adding like Fanueil Street in Brighton and other places called Fanueil to that like list?
I would consider it, but people, you know, the critics are right to this extent. They say, well, where do you stop? Because you have Washington Street, 5 of them in Boston, the old slaves. You have Fanueil, the housing development, right, in Brighton, every street. You got Jefferson Street. You got so many public monuments and identifications throughout the city, and I think it's redundant. I think it's redundant. I think it's important to identify an iconic symbol like Fanueil Hall as a way to get to the conversation. That's what most important for me and others. Let's have the conversation that leads to genuine reconciliation, truth, public inclusion in terms of the history, and justice. And what does that mean? What does justice mean? Well, it could mean changing public school policy in such ways that there is true competitiveness on the elementary school level in terms of getting into exam schools, for example. We know that there are about 5 schools throughout the city on the elementary level that are purposely loaded with luxuries and advantages that ensure that whites will be afforded the seats in Boston Latin, one of the most prestigious public schools in the nation. So if we think about having these real tough conversations, these honest conversations, over a protracted period of time, it's not going to happen in a year or two. But if we commit ourselves to a protracted conversation so that at the end of the day, we're better people in terms of engaging each other as whites, Latinos, blacks, Asians, Cape Verdeans, whatever the diversity of the Commonwealth is. If we come a little closer to that, then that's success. But beyond that, if we get there, if we have those real conversations and that honesty, then we're able to talk about policy change. And that's where the rubber hits the road. That's what was so beautiful about Rosa Parks symbolically sitting down on the bus. It was symbolic. But Dr. King and others, a lot of other women understood that the symbolism would lead to policy change. And so we had the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and so we had the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and so we have the 1968 Housing Act. That symbolism of Rosa Parks in that dusty bus in Montgomery in 1955 was so important in terms of leading to the policy that Dr. King was so brave and so courageous to give his life for, along with
others. To address the idea of how do we conduct ourselves as good stewards of history, that may not be exclusively ours. The fact of the matter is that all of our history is shared history. All of our history belongs to all of us. We are together in this world, and the most important thing I think that we can do is to continue to tell these stories. Tell the messy stories, tell the uncomfortable stories, tell the stories that aren't told. Don't let the stories that are important be forgotten. And I know for Native people, so often what we face as far as discrimination is just being invisibilized, being treated as if we don't exist today, as if our history is just Thanksgiving and then we disappear and the inevitable face of a dominant white race when they arrive. This idea of manifest destiny, that we're just the vanishing savages. And so just to continue to tell our stories is, for Native people to include us, is so important. I mean, thank you for acknowledging the Crispus Attuck's biracial heritage, because, you know, so often he's held up simply as an African American, and this does a disservice to everybody because it reduces our humanity in general. You know, the fact of the matter is that people did love each other across color lines. People did come together with common goals. I mean, you know, the fact that you want to change Fanueil Hall to Crispus Attuck, how appropriate, because the majority of the slaves were both African and Native here. This was the slave population. And this is what Fanueil Hall needs to be reflected of. It's not for the person who benefited of that, but the people who suffered it. So continue to tell these stories, continue to have these discussions. Somebody asked about how can we help who he calls a senator. And please do. Everybody in this room would be great if you called your senator, if you called your representative. But how many people are in this room? Continue to have the discussions. Help us to share these stories with other people. Tell people that you know. If you've got an organization that can help to bring another forum like this together, to another room full of people like this, help us to do that. Because this is so important, and it's important not only to trying to pass the legislation, but more importantly, it's about changing our sense of ourselves, our sense of people, our sense of how we get along as human beings. So to continue to tell these stories, to share these stories, to bring these discussions into the room, and to really talk about the things that matter, I think is so important. So I think that's really what needs to happen. And I think as long as we're telling the stories, as long as we're out there and pushing against that wall, we're doing the work that needs to be done.
Trauma creates fractions within a family, within a tribe, within a, you know, and I see this with my own Cuban roots. I mean, everybody is like, you know, I obviously being a first generation Cuban, I have a different perception of Castro, and I respect my elders and what they've been through. But he stood up to imperialism, which I respect. But, you know, all these Cubans come here and they become Republicans, and so that's just an example. But this happens across the board. So is there any guidance in that place of, you know, how to heal, you know, that deep, what it creates, this isolation and trauma and like division, you know, it's the oldest trick in the book to pin the poor against the poor, or pin each other against each other. So if there's any guidance that First Nations can please.
Isn't that kind of similar, just probably don't mind me asking, but isn't that kind of similar like when you were saying how sometimes the English would ally with like the Iroquois to destroy your people, this whole kind of pitting the marginalized against the marginalized?
Well, I think there's some of that, but I think if I understand your question correctly, or is in terms of, you know, looking at historical trauma and how to move through and past that. And I don't have the answer to that. I think one of the things is, as Hartman was saying, is continue to tell our stories. Continue to make sure that those things don't continue to get buried. Because the more they get buried, the longer the trauma goes on. I don't have a magic, you know, I don't have if you think about it, I think that most people of color in this country suffer from historical trauma. And so, and some of that is from the standpoint of how do we come together to support each other so that we are not going through it alone. So that's sort of my perspective, but I don't really have an answer. I don't know if anybody else wants to.
I think it's a part of it is the learning and teaching your children, teaching your family how to walk in multiple worlds, because there's a system that we're all talking about making change in, and that's sort of the obfuscation layer. But underneath, in the family, in the home, you have your traditions, you have your language, you have your food, you have everything that ties back to centuries. And one thing that I wanted to actually kind of when I was looking at when I keep looking at the symbol on the state seal, the man that's here, the composite image, and how our bodies are policed. You know, this is the head. This figure has already been decapitated because the head is not his own. The head is the head of an Ojibwe chief. And why? Because somebody outside of our community said that this person looks Indian enough to represent the Indians that are here. And I don't know, I don't know if you can see, but we don't necessarily look like this guy. But that's okay, because we have to be proud of all of who we are. We have to celebrate all of who we are. And we go back into history and we look at the connections of our ancestors and the ways that our paths have woven and interconnected. That's the richness. And we have to learn how to walk in those ways while we're trying to function in this larger system, and we're trying to get it to the more perfect union, carbon copy of the great law of peace, but still, we have to have it starts in the home. It starts in grounding your children and your family with, this is who we are, these are the languages that we speak, this is the food that we have, and this is why it's so good to be us.
We have time for a couple more.
Okay, well, there's certainly a lot of trauma, different things that have, come up through different times. As mentioned, we fought with the Iroquois, and that was a hard point. We fought with them for 800 years. We were, at one point, one people with a Narragansett, and some kind of fight at a pond broke us into two people. And these historical things have happened. But I think one of the really important things is keeping your eyes on the finish line. Remembering the world that you want it to be, and continue to push towards that, and not to dismiss or to not acknowledge those traumas or those pains, but to remember to keep moving towards what we want to be as something better. To keep moving towards that, not to forget what we've gone through or to dismiss what we've had to endure to get there, but to keep moving towards that better place is really important, because that's the healing that we're reaching for. I think is that ability to really treat each other as human beings, and when you can start to do that more, you can start to heal those traumas of the things that happened that weren't right, the things that happened in the family where people didn't treat each other well or did harmful things to each other. Those things are only repaired when we start showing each other kindness, and when we start showing each other some kind of good intention. They can't just be left alone. We have to do something to repair them. So to move forward is to take action to be the better people that we're supposed to be. And that's really important, I think.
So I think you had a question or comment? Yes.
Can everyone hear me? Yes. Okay, awesome. My name is Maya. I work for the Council on American-Islamic Relations here in Massachusetts. We're a civil rights organization for Muslims in the United States. And
I mean, I think that well, all of us can't always, be everywhere, but I think if it might be easier to go to the organization's website. They have all of our contact information, and I'm sure there are other people that are also willing to talk about this. And then, if there's particular people that you want to get in contact with, you can do that through the organization's website. But I mean, I think that many of us are willing to do this, but we're only, a few people, so.
Can I also say, I didn't mean to place that labor to. At all.
Yes.
Just out of curiosity, if there's more of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think as long as, would you speak, if that's something you're willing to?
I would only suggest that there may be people sitting near you in the room, and we're about to end in within 5 minutes. Maybe they would come and talk to you as well about how this could be done locally through the faith communities, etc. But it's a good question.
Could the film be edited and distributed?
Of course, the film could be published.
Is it adequately filmed tonight?
This is just Facebook Live. It's kind of a medium quality video.
Right.
It's going to be viewable, but it's
Right.
probably not going to be
Okay.
the perfect.
Well, would it also be possible for Mass Peace Action to play a role in trying to triage what she's putting forward? Like if you got in touch with the Massachusetts Peace Action website as well, and we can get in touch with people if you have specific requests. But I agree with Elizabeth, it's a little hard to coordinate the whole group.
On the sign-up sheet, there's a question of can you organize an event in your, I forget what it says, your campus, your church or something, and so we'll see how many of those requests would come back, and then we'll have to figure out how to fulfill them.
Yes.
It's just on this actually, because as we were speaking about the website, I went to it and there is a link to get a host. So we have two options.
If you want a speaker, we'll provide you with at least one.
Should we choose this option or Mass Peace option, or just either?
Try both. See who answers first.
Well, it's just that when you mention everything we talked about tonight, this is specifically about the flag and seal, and that is the main focus, but we addressed other issues.
We've learned much more tonight than you'll find on just one website.
I mean, to build this campaign, we're going to need a lot of people, a lot of organizations working together. So hopefully we're planting a seed and we can keep this expanding.
And I guess finally, if make sure you've signed up and that you've written your email or phone number legibly so that you can be followed up with. That would be key, because we will send out information.
I don't think I answered Laura Wagner's question well enough. This could take place, some of the same education and outreach could take place in faith communities, in mosques, in friends meeting houses, in Unitarian societies. These conversations are ongoing in many of those, and if you want speakers, many of those organizations could, faith-based organizations could provide speakers as well.
I think we have, unless there's somebody who has a really burning question, we have 4 minutes left. And we do have time for maybe one more comment if somebody has one.
You have a really short one.
Yeah.
So changing the flag is not enough. This is land belongs to the indigenous people, and there needs to be sovereignty, and you guys have the right to deport all the white people back to Europe if you want some recognition.
Might be a little extreme.
Well, yeah, and I can joke about that. A lot of white people don't understand that most of our food and a good deal of our medicine is Native American in origin. So just don't let white people eat or take medicine. Let them die slowly off of disease and starvation.
Now these are not the notes. These are not the notes we hope to end the meeting.
Right.
It's a joke.
Right. But we do want to thank the speakers once again for coming out, and all of you as well. So let's give a round of applause to folks. So we'll keep in touch.